Hello.
And applaud you should. This book, actually I'm in a rare position. I do a lot of book events. I've actually read this book. I realize, I'm not sure it's good for Ray that I have, but I have. This book is lots of books in one. First and foremost, it's a love story about an amazing marriage of a young lady wearing orange of over 50 years. It's an autobiography of an extraordinary life. And what's so interesting about the life is at so many stages, the guy on my left did things that he didn't need to do, but for whatever reason he wanted to do and felt compelled to do. And I thought I knew him, and I kept learning stuff about him. He's got more degrees than any of our fellows, I think. It's very interesting how he pushed himself in lots of different directions, in lots of different dimensions. It's a story about terrorism, but more important in some ways, terrorism avoided. And the vignettes or the stories of a dozen or so attacks that were contemplated and planned, but fortunately never completed and carried out, makes for fascinating but also harrowing reading, because and something we'll talk about, you realize just how close we came sometimes. What Machiavelli called fortuna. We had some fortuna on our side, and fortuna, though, is not something you can always count on. So it's sobering in certain ways. It's obviously a story of dealing with crime, and also a success story there, I think, in many ways. Ray Kelly had a major role in helping to make this city a truly livable and relatively safe place for its millions of inhabitants and visitors. And it's an interesting book because it deals openly with some of the challenges about how do you balance, how do you get it right between civil liberties, both in the counterterrorism space as well as in the crime space, and how do you protect rights at the same time you protect people, and where do you draw those lines and where do you get those balances? And there's no easy or glib answers. And so if you read the book, I think you get a better appreciation for it. The book is called Vigilance, which tells you something. The subtitle is My Life Serving America and Protecting its Empire City. We've been lucky enough here at the council to have had an association with Ray since he stepped down, and he's been a distinguished visiting fellow with us and among us. And so on behalf of all of us, again, we want to congratulate you on the book, but we also want to thank you for all you've done with us and for us.
Well, thank you, Richard.
And that's a really tough introduction to an interview, if you've ever heard one. I mean, really. Any of those journalists tomorrow night doing the debate, that'll be a hard act to follow. Sort of antagonistic journalism here. So what I want to do is, in some ways, start with some of the basics, almost a philosophical question. When you deal with the pendulum between making a society safe, but how you deal with individual rights, or the questions of whether it's in the terrorism space or the crime space, how is it you think about that? What goes on in your mind about the question, when you think of the balances, when you think of the trade-offs? What's your vision of the problem? And then where do you come out and why?
Well, let me start off by thanking you, Richard, for everything you've done for me. You're right, you provided a home for me when I left the police department. I am distinguished, visiting fellow. Some people question the distinguished part, but you have been absolutely terrific, and I want to thank you for that and thank the council for that. I just want to point out one person. You've already introduced my wife and my son. David Cohn, who is a real hero, New York City hero, is in the book, and he happens to be here. I haven't seen David in a while. He's been traveling. David, it is great to see you, pal. And if you get the book, which I urge you to do, you'll see some fascinating things about
I should just
David.
say that when Ray came here, one of the big innovations he made was essentially giving this city an intelligence and counterterrorism capability that it needed. And the gentleman he brought from a place called Washington, D.C., actually it was in Langley, Virginia. And he brought David, who had had a senior role there on the interesting side of that place. And he brought him here to New York to stand up what has really become, no pun intended, a world-class intelligence capability. And for that, we are all grateful. So it's great.
Cool.
Despite the Boston accent, you're welcome in this room.
Boston is in down here these days. How do we address the issue, the balance? Well, I am an attorney, and it is something that has concerned me through my professional life. I see myself, and the book mentions this, as a civil libertarian in many ways, and it's something we were very conscious of, and certainly David Cohn was conscious of. We brought in, among other things, a cadre of world-class lawyers, in my opinion, fitting with the world-class intelligence operation. Former assistant U.S. attorneys, former district attorneys, people who had really in-depth knowledge and experience in the area. And particularly when we look in the intelligence field, all of the reports, all of the activities of the intelligence division were vetted by these attorneys. All the intelligence reports, DD5s as they're called, inside the house were examined and combed through. It's a delicate balance. People, when you talk about the crime side of the house, we obviously had a high-profile case, an issue concerning stop and frisk. It's something that we thought about quite a bit, and the practice itself is validated by a Supreme Court decision. It's codified in every state in the union. We were very careful to train people, to show them how to do it. I believe the case itself, the case that went to court, was just bad law, and it certainly wasn't supported by the facts in the case. And the judge herself was removed from the case because of pretrial publicity by the Second Circuit, which would have heard the case, heard the appeal. If Mayor Bloomberg's appeal had been allowed to go forward, Mayor de Blasio chose not to do that. So, but being involved in the law and being concerned about individual civil rights is part and parcel to the job of police commission and the people that he or she has to have around them. And I think we did a good job in that respect.
I want to get to stop and frisk in a minute, or as you called it in the book, stop, question, and frisk. But let's put that off to the side for 1 or 2 minutes. When you left office, how much by then do you think the city resolved the challenge of integrating intelligence? You're getting it for all these directions, all these different federal, state, local capabilities. It was an integration issue. It was a coordination and cooperation issue. How far advanced had things gotten by the time you left? You can compare it to when you got here, but compare it also to where you think it needs to be.
Well, we are light years ahead of where we were when we came on board. The intelligence division then was basically kind of an escort unit for VIPs. It did very little what I would call intelligence. It did gather information concerning crimes. We had there was a field intelligence officer in each of our precincts, and they were reasonably effective at that level. But we changed the game dramatically, and David Cohn certainly was a major factor in that regard. But intelligence never comes in neat packages. It's contradictory. It's kind of messy. People think, well, you got this piece of intelligence. No, it doesn't work like that. You get a little bit of here and a little bit there, and you kind of have to put it together, and that's what David and his people, I think, did very well. We were able to bring in, as a result of sort of David's gravitas, people from the CIA, people who had experience working in intelligence, and then that sort of spread. Then it was, we were attracting people, first-class people, because this is where they wanted to be. This is where the action was. But in terms of integration, it's not as smooth as you'd like it to be. Much of the information that we were receiving comes through the Joint Terrorism Task Force, no question about it. but we're able to get information from other sources and information from our, for other agencies and information from our own people as well in the field. Always a challenge, and in this day and age, there's not nearly as much usable information as we'd like. The people think, oh, there's lots of stuff coming in. Well, it's not coming in necessarily in the volume we'd like.
When you left, which was what, just over a year and a half ago now? What's the timing on that?
Yeah. Well,
Even though ISIS was already up and running, it hadn't reached the capability, much less the prominence it has now. So now we're in a different period, if you will, of global terrorism. You were, in some ways, the commissioner during what you might call the age of Al-Qaeda. Now we're in slightly more the age of ISIS. And one of the things about ISIS is it does what you might call retail inspiration through the internet. And it isn't necessarily people who go to camps and get trained that come back or can be tracked. You've got a very different problem. What is your sense about what has to be done differently in order to meet that? Is it your sense that we're doing it or not?
I think we're going to be fighting this battle for a long, long time to come. I think the whole ISIS phenomena is something that is not going to be addressed in the Middle East unless we're able to put together coalitions. For myself, I don't think we should put any U.S. ground troops in the Middle East to fight them at this juncture, other than perhaps special operations components. We look at Turkey has 500,000 troops under arms, Egypt 500,000, Saudi Arabia 250,000. Right there, three countries, over 1 million troops. So that's what I think ideally should be done to fight them on the ground. But the much more challenging and vexing problem is this inspirational aspect, where they and their surrogates putting out almost 90,000 tweets or retweets a day. So there is that glut of that sort of information that I think is difficult to sort. And we're always going to have, at least in my judgment, in my lifetime, disaffected young people who will look at these videos, and when they're very sophisticated, very slick, and decide to kill people in their own country. That's just
to the extent that sometimes these things are going to succeed. One of the studies over the years we've done here is not just on counterterrorism prevention, but on resilience. Is it your sense, how we cope as a city with the inevitable successes? The terrorists are going to have some tactical successes. Right. Is there a lot more we can and should be doing there to make this city, because you're never going to bat 1,000 against it. You've got to become stronger in coping with it.
I think, and when we left, I think we were doing everything we reasonably can do. I have no reason to believe that they have backed off from that approach significantly. So we're an open city. 10 million people a day are in here on a work day. We're vulnerable, no question about it. I think we did a good job. We were I think resolute in trying to sort it out, but we were lucky too. Faisal Shahzad drove into the middle of Times Square. We didn't know him. It wasn't on anybody's radar screen, and tried to blow up a car next to the Marriott Hotel. He found a parking spot on a Saturday night, 7 o'clock. What a miracle. And the reason that bomb didn't go off is because he dumbed it down. He thought he was a naturalized Pakistani, he was born in Pakistan, naturalized U.S. citizen, and thought that he would be identified. If he wanted to buy firecrackers, which he was told to do in Pennsylvania, that he may be identified because he, in his mind, looked, quote, Pakistani. So he dumbed it down. He bought firecrackers of a less volatility, M88s instead of M80s, that sort of thing. If he had stayed with the formula, it would have worked, and you would have had a major event in Times Square. Those sorts of things are just very, very difficult to totally stop. There's a lot of good work being done in chat rooms. There's work being done by undercover police officers here, confidential informants who are outside the department. But you can't continue to bat 1,000.
One last question on the terrorism front, and it gets a bit of the civil liberties issue. And to use a cliche that you sometimes see, most of the world's Muslims are not terrorists, but most of today's terrorists happen to be Muslim. How is it this city maintains good relations with the Muslim community, yet has sufficient access to it so it can find out whether there are problems that are brewing? How do you balance that?
Yeah, well, I think we had very good relations with the Muslim community. We put together early on a Muslim Advisory Council, and this was not people in the choir. These were folks who had some very strong opinions. I meet with them on a regular basis. I think a lot of community interaction was done on the part of police officers. We engaged in a major recruiting effort so that the department now has police officers born in 106 countries, which is just phenomenal in my view. It just doesn't exist anywhere else. That diversity obviously involved Muslim officers. There's a Muslim Officers Association that has increased in size. There's a DC Association, which is South Asia. So I believe we, on our watch, had very good relations with certainly the leadership of the Islamic world. Did we make everybody happy? No. Did we have people who objected to what we did? Absolutely. Did I meet with them? Yes, I did. So we had that sort of dialogue ongoing. And you don't hear that sort of, there's not rumblings in the community about the police department. You'll have some activists who will complain. I did complain on our watch. But I don't think that's the general consensus of the Muslim community in New York City.
Just a couple of questions on policing, and then we'll open it up. Two things you say in the book I want to highlight. One is you've come around on the question of body cams. Would you talk about that for a second, about why?
Yeah, I think body cameras are going to cause police officers to hesitate. There could be a good thing, could be a bad thing. What I wanted was more of a sort of a pilot program period of time to see what the effects of that hesitation would be. But after I saw the horrific murder of Walter Scott in North Charleston, South Carolina, I said, what sort of individual, assuming a sane individual, police officer, would do what that officer did if he were wearing a body camera? So to me, it was a game changer, and I think the train has left the station as far as cameras are concerned. Police departments have to, in my judgment, adopt it. There's lots of logistic problems. How do you store the information? Who has access to it? That sort of thing. But it's something that, in my view, has to be done because I think it will have an impact, significant impact on getting back that level of trust that in this city, I think we worked very hard to achieve. In 2013, our last year, the Bloomberg administration, the department had a 70% approval rating, and I had a 75% approval rating. I say that not to brag, but to indicate what the relationship was like. This is after 11 years and change in office. I think these high-profile events set that back. It's understandable throughout the country. You see that sort of thing. I think the adoption of cameras will make a difference in when they're implemented more or when they're deployed more than they are now. Will make a difference in sort of getting back that level of trust.
You had this long and distinguished career in the Marines. And yet something else that surprised me a bit in the book was your criticism of the giving a lot of police departments combat equipment that's normally associated with troops in combat in our cities. Say something about that, because you're one of the people who bridges those two worlds, the world of military combat, the world of policing. You basically think that a lot of this arming doesn't make sense.
I don't, and this was a well-intentioned, good faith effort on the part of the military to deploy their excess equipment in the 90s to police agencies. It seemed to be sort of a logical connection, logical nexus there between the military and police. It really wasn't well thought out, and the types of equipment kept getting more and more muscular, I guess, and something that is not appropriate on the streets of this country, I think. It just gives a bad signal, bad optics. We saw that in Ferguson, but we've seen it in other places as well. It started off with just trucks, vehicles, that sort of thing. But then it got into weapons, it got into these big Amtraks, and then you saw police officers in military garb, helmets and camouflage vests, that sort of thing. It just looks bad. It's not the appropriate weaponry to have on as far as civilian policing is concerned. Now, I think some of this equipment should be storehoused, kept at a state level in the event of a natural disaster, that sort of thing. But I just saw a movie last night called Peace Officer. I don't know if any of you have seen it. But it speaks to this issue about the over-militarization of the police. And it shows small towns in America with this equipment. And unfortunately, bad shootings happen as a result. A pretty well done movie. But no, I think that has to be removed, and chiefs have to look at it through the prism of, hey, you're dealing with the community here. Suppose you're on the other side. How would you like to see an army coming at you?
I've got one last question before I open it up to our members. In the context in which your book's been published, you obviously now have a degree of violence often along racial lines between police and minorities. What would you do if you were still in the job, or what would you recommend? How do you begin to reverse that dynamic? And is there a role for something like stop and frisk in that? Is that part of the solution, or has the politics changed that can no longer be part of the solution?
Well, I certainly think it should be implemented. I don't see anything wrong with it. As I say, validated by Supreme Court case. I don't think it was overused here. What we were punished for, in a way, is better record keeping. When I was a police officer and stopped people, I didn't record it, very seldom recorded it. We required police officers to record it because we wanted to know what they were doing. We have an obligation to know what officers are doing. This was, and by the way, the litigation against the city started in 1999. This is not recent, litigation that had to do specifically with the Bloomberg administration. It started quite a while ago and so terminated in a case that was uniquely coincided with the mayoral race here. His timing was quite interesting as to how this case came out, and depending on what you want to see or look at, and as far as the record is concerned, a lot of very important evidence was left out of that case. But your question, does it play a role? Absolutely. If you go to communities of color, and that, there's an activist community and then there's the grassroots community. You go to the grassroots community, they want to be safe. And they want to be treated with dignity and respect, but there's a tremendous amount of support in communities of color for stop, question, and frisk and other tactics and strategies that have made them safe. Now, 97% of the shootings in this city happen, the victims are Black or Latino. That's where the violence is. They see themselves disproportionately victimized, and they see it, many people, and not all, I understand that, but many people see it as a way of controlling guns and shootings in their neighborhood. And I happen to agree with them. Should not be done randomly. You need reasonable suspicion to stop someone. But if you're out on the street in a lot of neighborhoods, and you build up a certain eye and sense of where suspicious activity is happening or where it's about to happen, and I think it's something that should be fully restored. Now, police officers have been given all sorts of signals that you don't do this, or you do it in a very very small number, or the number that has been quoted is 40,000. Well, there are hundreds of thousands of calls just in the 911 system about suspicious activity. So a city of 8.4 million people, where almost 6 million people travel a day in the subway system, that have only 40,000 stops, it's just very, very low. And it's certainly not reflective of the suspicious activity that police officers encounter, or should encounter, assuming they're doing their job.
Want to open up for questions? Just before I do, I want to recognize also one of your other deputies, Rich Falkenrath. I saw who
There he is, Rich Faulkner. I didn't see him there.
had the counterterrorism mantle, basically working closely with David on the info thing.
Rich is another star. I was so fortunate to have him. He was President Bush's Homeland Security advisor and was literally one of the designers of the whole Department of Homeland Security. He was just a tremendous asset. I happened to see something today where the mayor was in the command center in police headquarters. Rich was the person primarily responsible for having that whole command center built. He got the money, the federal money, and helped in the design and layout. So he is a true star. He's now gone on to the private sector, though. I know the feeling, but but it's terrific. Great to have you here.
We're looking forward to him to endowing a chair at the Council on Foreign Relations. So we're hoping he succeeds.
That's right. He's a member here. Yeah.
Let's open it up to questions for members. Just stand and introduce yourself, ask a question, wait for the microphone, and we'll jam in as many as we come. Steve?
Yeah, Stephen Schlesinger from the Century Foundation. What do you think about the hiring of another 1,200 police officers under the current administration?
Well, any administrator, you always want more resources, but the job that was done under the Bloomberg administration, and when we left, we had a record low crime, record low shootings, record low murders, record low shootings by police officers. I mentioned a 70% approval rating, and that was done with 6,000 fewer police officers than the previous administration had. So the job was being done, and this administration decided to add more police officers. Now, if I was sitting in that seat, I'd say, hey, great, we can do more with it. But whether or not it was needed is, I don't have the answer to that question.
Yes, ma'am. Just wait for the microphone.
Congratulations. Whoops, I'm sorry. It's Consuelo Mack, and
Hi.
I'm my husband, former deputy police
I
commissioner
didn't
under
see him.
Ray
Yeah.
as well. So we're delighted to be here, and congratulations on the book. What about police morale? We're talking about community morale and relations to police, but I'm wondering how the police are feeling and what we can do to encourage them and motivate them as well to stick with an honorable profession when they are feeling under fire.
Yeah. Just let me say something about Walter Mack. In the first time as police commissioner, we did something that was really unique. Walter was a very experienced assistant U.S. attorney, and to run our internal affairs operations, to do the investigations of police officers, I brought in Walter to be the deputy commissioner of internal affairs. He did a terrific job. Thank you, Consuelo. Yeah, morale. I said it to someplace recently. Every year I was in the department 40-something years. Just ask the union. Morale has never been lower. Let's keep going down. That's it. I mean, morale in policing it's obviously a self-selecting job, and most cops love the job. Now, what is the objective criteria of morale for the rest of the world? People vote with their feet. If you don't like it someplace, you're going to leave. In 2013, or last year, we had the lowest percentage of people leaving the department with less than 20 years of service, but police officers. And then we had the lowest percentage of police officers after 20 years retiring. So, and that, to me, is a significant indicator of morale. Now, we know in 2008 we had big economic problems. I'm talking 2013. The situation was different. You could have said, well, no, police are not leaving. There's no work out there. So I think that is a very meaningful indicator. Now, as far as what's going on now, it's difficult for me to judge. Obviously, there is a little bit of not a little bit, there is an attack on police officers, verbal attacks, and we saw some of that culminate in this outright assassination of police officers Lou and Ramos here in December. But I think that it could be it's a blip, and I think for a relatively short period of time. Police officers, generally speaking, really like what they do. It's exciting. It's camaraderie, a bonding experience. I loved it, and I don't think I'm unique. It is the sort of like the military, a little bit bringing people together, and I think, and union people will say whatever they want to say about morale, but you stop the average cop in the street and ask them, do you like your job or do you love your job? They're going to say yes.
Sure, Warren. Mr. Hoag.
Warren Hoag, International Peace Institute. Ray, I was at the same film you were at last night. And that police officer, who was a remarkable police officer from Utah, came down to talk to us afterwards. And of course, he's in New York, so we asked him about gun control. And he said, I believe in guns. I'm a Second Amendment guy. I wanted to ask you, you served a mayor who's passionate about gun control and has put so much resources into it. From your point of view as a police commissioner, as a police officer, is gun control necessary? Is it effective? And do you see any future? It seems to be so hard to convince this country of the necessity for gun control.
Yeah, it's a complex question. I see no gun legislation coming down the pike. It's a third rail in Washington on both sides of the aisle. Is it effective? Generally speaking, no. We have over 300 million guns abroad in this country. Even if we stop manufacturing them tomorrow, we still have 300 million guns to deal with. Practically speaking, I don't think we're going to see any legislation that is going to address even something as simple as the gun show loophole. What is the gun show loophole? It is this fiction that you go to a gun show and you and I are private people and I'm going to sell you a gun. Well, we don't need a background check because you're we're just private folks and that's fine. Now, some states have tried to address that. 36 states have some attempt to address that, but there's still 14 states that leave this wide open, and many crime guns come through that opening. I was Undersecretary of Treasury in the Clinton administration. ATF was reporting to me. To the best of my knowledge, the last report that was done on the issue of where crime guns were coming from and what the effect of the gun show loophole is, was a report on my watch, and that was in the late 1990s. So there's no desire in Washington to do anything about it. It's seen as very, very politically dangerous. Here in New York, 90% of the guns that are confiscated come from out of state. They come from Florida, they come from Virginia, West Virginia, Pennsylvania. And you go hop on a bus, get a gun, and maybe 5 guns, come up here, sell it for 2.5, 3 times what you paid for it. I don't see any short-term solution to this problem. The only real solution can be a national policy. It's not happening in my mind. So we're stuck with the problem.
That's about another social policy issue, which is drugs and criminal penalties. Whether, from your perspective, too many young men in particular are being sent to jail for things they ought not to be sent to jail for.
I think we've seen a shift throughout the country where, for the most part now, people who are incarcerated are there for violent crimes. I think de facto judges throughout the country have, gotten the message that, hey, young lives are being destroyed. That sort of thing is much more of a redirection towards treatment than ever before. The Rockefeller drug laws were changed here quite a while ago. So I think that was the case. I think it's much less now, and it will continue moving in that direction.
And you approve of that?
Yeah, I do.
Mr. Rose?
Dan Rose, you're a hero. You're among friends. A. B. Ta-Nehisi Coates, in his recent book to his son, tells his son to be more afraid of police than of the murderous thugs in the neighborhood. And the public cheers. What is the most effective reply to the Ta-Nehisi Coates position?
Well, it's obviously an emotional issue for parents, for people of color. There's a perception out there in certain communities that that racial profiling goes on with great abandon. Then you see these high-profile cases, and the suspicion's confirmed in a lot of people's minds, unfortunately. I mean, I've been in the business for a long time, over 40 years, just in the police department. I know the good work that goes on. I know that the communities of color need help. As I said before, 90% of the murder victims are Black or Latino, 97% of the shooting victims, that's where the shootings happen. 50% of the murder victims in the United States are African American. So that's where the help is needed. And the police are there because they're called by members of the community. They're not just showing up. They're there because the community wants them to be there. I think it's going to be a long time before we ever get over that perception in a lot of people's minds. Ben Ward, who was my mentor, the police commissioner, he would say, talking about African American community, he'd say, people want crime to go down in those communities, but don't stop my son. So it's sort of this duality of thinking, and I think that is, unfortunately, a fairly widely held view in the African American community. I think some of the ways you lessen that is by diversity. I think you want a department that reflects the people that you serve. Not only is the right thing to do, it makes the job easier. And as I said before, 106 countries, but even the African American number in the police department, I think is pretty good. It's about 16, a little over 16%. It's come down from 17%. But the African American population in the city has gone down to 23%. So, it's not that far away. We certainly try to close it. Mayor Dinkins just came in here. Hello, Mayor. How are you? Hi, Colonel. Mayor Dinkins, at the end of Mayor Dinkins' term, I was the commissioner. We did a lot of recruiting in black churches, and it worked. And one of the things, the next administration coming in, there was a requirement that you have 60 college credits, and that was kicking in the next year. So what we had hoped would happen is that would be waived particularly for the list that we were putting together. But it wasn't waived. It was an opportunity that was missed. I still think that black churches are a very good avenue to approach as far as getting young men and women interested in policing. But to answer your question, frankly, I don't think that issue is going to go away anytime soon in a lot of African American parents' minds.
Yes, ma'am.
Janet Benshoff.
Janet, I just want to wait for a microphone so we can all hear you.
Janet Benshoff, could you address the role of more police women in New York City, or how you think the department could change if it were 50% women? Thank you.
Yeah, well, the department's about 18% female now, and that is a pretty high number when you compare it to police departments throughout America. There, in every position, there is a 3-star, which is the highest uniform level next to the chief of the department, and many precinct commanders now. So they're sort of dispersed throughout the department. and not unlike what you see now going on in the military, at least that discussion. 50% women, it's a good question. I have to think about it a little more. It is a fact that in some situations you need physicality. You know, you just do. At 2 o'clock in the morning, you need to be able to sort of enforce rules, regulations, laws, that sort of thing. Would that be, yeah, let me say this, that there's no height requirement anymore in police. It's all been eliminated in as far as lawsuits and civil service regulations are concerned. I want to think about it more, but I think the department has made pretty good progress in putting women in significant roles throughout it.
Mr. Rosenwald? Here in the front row.
John Rosenwald, J.P. Morgan, and a friend of all Kellys. First, thank you for what you did for this town.
Thank you.
Ray, when you were in office, you implemented a policy of stationing abroad a number of NYPD officers with strong language capabilities to serve as sort of a listening post overseas. I was just wondering whether the new administration has continued that policy.
Yes, they have, and that was an idea that I think David and I came up with collectively. We find out whose idea it was. I was the U.S. Customs Commissioner. We had LEGATs, legal attaches, outside of the country. And I found it to be pretty effective as far as getting information back. So we thought that was a good idea, and particularly starting off with Tel Aviv. We had one police officer. And because of the diversity of the department, you have tremendous reservoir of talent to draw from. So our first officer we put into Tel Aviv, and that's when that was before the Sharon Wall, and there was a lot of activity going on. So we were getting real granular information quickly as what was going on in Israel. And again, the notion was to put people overseas to protect this city. We want to know what's going on in other places that can help us protect in New York. But you needed a receptive, friendly environment to do that. So I would never put someone in Pakistan. Quite frankly, I think it's too dangerous an environment. But we wound up with police officers assigned in Abu Dhabi, which we put a male and female couple there, both born in Egypt, but a police officer and a lieutenant. His Egyptian-born police officer wife was with him in Lyon, France, which is where Interpol is located, and interacting with lots of other countries. In Madrid, and we have a detective who had been born in Madrid, in Paris, in London, in Amman, Jordan, in Montreal, Toronto, because we're concerned about the northern border, Singapore, and the Dominican Republic. We had really just a talent pool that was really, top-notch, and we're able to do that. They have proven very effective, particularly when something happens either in their location or in another location. When Mumbai bombing took place, the Mumbai massacre, really, we were able to get 3 of them on the ground very quickly. They sent back information to us very, very quickly. That Mumbai took 3 days, and they were there on the last day of the event. They went to the Shabbat Lubavitch house, real specific information. We had sent police officers there for a bombing of 7 trains the year before, so we had very good relations there. We brought in 500 security directors into our auditorium that following Friday, hooked them up with a telephone conversation. They produced a 75-page report about what they found. We had a tabletop exercise with all our commanders, and we had an actual exercise done out in Floyd Bennett Field that we watched on our television screens, all within less than a week. So it gives us tremendous flexibility. They were there. We're very smart people. They got us granular very worthwhile information, and we used it to help us protect New York. One of the outgrowths of that is we increased the number of special weapons people that we have, because you need some capacity to deal with heavy weapons. We had about 400 emergency service officers. We took officers from our Organized Crime Control Bureau and trained them so that they could augment the emergency service officers. And we also filmed the insides of the hotels, the major hotels here, to familiarize police officers with the structures. They don't normally go into hotels. So my point is, a lot came out of them being overseas, and we got it all very quickly. I think it's a very valuable program. All indications are that we're going to keep it in place.
This young lady there has been patient. Last question.
Annie, 1 William Street. Thank you for your service to New York City.
Thank you.
We've spoken about terrorism and violent crime, but we haven't spoken about cybersecurity. What else should the Financial Cyber Crimes Task Force and law enforcement broadly be doing about cybersecurity?
It is a huge problem, and just the article today in the Times talking about it. And we just don't have a sufficient deterrent effect. I mean, you have the state sponsors of cyber intrusions. Russia, we have Iran, we have China. These are the obvious ones. Then you have the next level down, these sort of Ocean's 11 teams that are in it for the money in crime. Advanced persistent threats, they call it. And it's very difficult to attribute where intrusion is coming from. And with these advanced persistent threat entities, they're very amorphous. They could be sitting in Belarus and doing something here. And so let's assume we know that there's a team in Belarus doing something. Well, we have to work with the authorities in Belarus. There's no compacts that allow us to do that. What do you do? How do you deter that sort of attack? Then you have the in China they have the what they call patriotic hackers. We have thousands upon thousands of them that supposedly the government doesn't control. And then you have just the hackers, kids who are out to have fun in their minds. So it's very complex. We don't have a meaningful deterrent. It's only going to get worse before it gets better. I wish I had a better answer for it. You can't even get legislation passed in Washington. There's an issue of just having companies notify the government when they experience an intrusion. Well, they want a certain amount of protection to do that from liability, and that legislation can't be passed in war, and it's been floating around for years. So I'm very concerned about that. You can see you can think of all sorts of scenarios that would just make our lives much more difficult, let alone more dangerous. I wish I had a better answer, but I'm very concerned about it.
One last question. When you think about modern day policing, and you were going to talk to a young person who was thinking about making this a career, do you think in your mind of policing now as a largely anti-crime, but increasingly has to do counterterrorism on the side? Or increasingly now do you think of policing as a counterterrorism force that still does anti-crime work?
No, I would say it's still, anti-crime is the primary job. Anti-terrorism is much more specialized, but interacting with the community, being peace officers, as that movie emphasized last night, is really what it's all about. I think it's a terrific way to make a living. It's not for everybody. What I say in the book is that I think a college degree should be required of virtually every police officer. Teachers throughout America, even in most rural communities, are pretty much required of a 4-year college degree. Police officers are not. Yet the jobs become much more complex, much more demanding. And I think what you want to do is sort of elevate the pool of people who may go into into policing. And I think that would change a lot over time. We need that education, and we need, I think, a 4-year baccalaureate degree. But it's a great way to make a living. As I say, not for everybody. It was great for me. I enjoy the excitement of it. I enjoy the ability to make a difference and to really help people.
If you add up Ray Kelly's time in the military and in the policing, he did more than half a century of public service. Made it to colonel, made it to commissioner. So Colonel Kelly, Commissioner Kelly, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.